Most nights, the retired trucker ate in silence, then glanced at the pickup resting in his dark yard, where a lean tricolor mother dog slept on the old quilt. Tonight, he set an envelope with the truck's title beside his keys, finally ready to sell it. Looking out, he saw her rigid on the quilt, staring toward the road instead of lying down. When he opened the back door, she blocked the tailgate, one paw on his keys, and he suddenly doubted the sale. The little house sat just off the two-lane highway, its windows dim against a fading March sky. Out back, the long-nosed pickup rested in the packed dirt like a tired horse turned out to pasture. Most evenings were quiet now. Only the hum of distant engines and the ticking of cooling metal. Yet tonight, as Hank settled into his worn chair, a faint scrape sounded from the direction of the truck, sharp enough to hold his breath. He told himself it was only a loose chain on the tailgate, or a branch dragged by the wind. Still, the sound had a pattern to it, soft and measured, like something taking cautious steps across metal. The floorboard under his boots gave a familiar creak as he rose, and a cool shiver slid across his shoulders, the kind that made a man suddenly aware of his own heartbeat. Outside, the night air smelled of damp dirt and old diesel. The yard lamp threw a pale circle that stopped short of the truck, leaving the far end in shadow. Hank stood on the back step, listening. There it was again, a faint shift, a whisper of weight sliding across the bed. His eyes strained at the dark outline of the tailgate, at the lump of blankets he kept there. He'd left that blanket out months ago, an old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, more out of habit than need. Now it looked disturbed, its edges rumpled into unfamiliar hills and valleys. A hint of movement trembled through the fabric, then stilled, as if whatever had pressed it down was holding its breath too. Hank swallowed, the back of his neck prickling. He stepped off the porch, gravel crunching under his boots, and walked halfway to the truck before stopping. The night wrapped around him, heavy and expectant. From the highway came the soft rush of a passing rig, headlights sweeping briefly over the fields, then fading. In that instant of borrowed light, he thought he saw the quilt sink, just slightly, under an unseen weight. His chest tightened. Maybe something feral had claimed the truck. Some creature drawn by the faint warmth of metal and old cotton. He pictured teeth, claws, the startled lunge if he got too close. Age had slowed his reflexes. His knees didn't forgive foolishness anymore. He stayed where he was, fingers flexing in the cold air, telling himself he was too old to spook at shadows. After a long minute, the movement stopped. The night returned to its usual sounds, the far-off whine of tires, the chirp of one stubborn insect, the faint hum of his refrigerator through the kitchen wall. Yet under it all lay something else, a quiet sense that the truck had not finished its work, that some part of his old life still waited for a signal. Hank turned back toward the house, jaw tight, feeling watched. Before closing the door, he glanced once more at the dark shape of the bed and the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed. The fabric lay still, but the impression along its middle seemed deeper than it had that morning, as if something had settled there and refused to leave. Hank locked the deadbolt, listened to it click, and knew in his bones that whatever was out there would be back tomorrow night. Frost silvered the yard by dawn, lacing the gravel with pale crystals. Hank stepped outside with his coffee, breath puffing into the chill. He meant only to start the truck and let it idle, the way he'd done for decades before sunrise. Instead, his eyes were drawn to the tailgate, where a delicate scatter of prints crossed the frozen dust, each mark small and oval, stamped in a purposeful arc. He crouched, knees complaining, and traced one of the prints with a gloved finger. Too neat for a raccoon, too large for a cat. The marks led from the back step to the tire tracks, then onto the lowered tailgate and across the quilt. The old patchwork quilt in the truck bed showed a shallow hollow, as if something had curled there for hours before slipping away. A faint musky scent lingered, warm against the morning air. That evening he left a chipped ceramic bowl by the bumper, filled with leftover stew and a hill of cornbread. It felt foolish even as he did it, like talking to himself in public, but the memory of those careful tracks tugged at him. When he checked before bed, the bowl remained untouched. He chuckled at his own imagination, told himself it truly must have been wind and shadows after all, and went inside. Just past midnight, a soft clink woke him, the sound of ceramic nudged against metal. Hank lay still, heart thudding, listening. A moment later came the faint thump of weight landing on the tailgate, followed by a rustle across the quilt. He eased to the window and parted the curtain. Under the yard lamp's weak glow, a lean shape stood in the truck bed, head low over the bowl, sides narrow but rounded toward the middle. He watched the animal lift its head, ears flicking toward the highway. Even from the window he could see the curve of her belly, heavy and full beneath a dusty coat. She froze, sensing his gaze, and for a heartbeat their eyes met across the yard. Dark on dark. Then she slipped off the bed in one fluid motion, disappearing under the truck and into the shadows beyond the fence. The bowl sat empty, rocking slightly. Over the next week, the pattern settled in like a new kind of clock. Each night near midnight, the bowl would clink, the tailgate would give the slightest creak, and the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed would sag under borrowed weight. Each morning, fresh prints crossed the frost, looping impatient circles around the truck before trailing toward the ditch and the highway's edge. Hank's doubt turned into a restless curiosity. He began sitting on the back step with his coffee after dark, pretending to admire the sky. The first time she returned while he was outside, he heard her before he saw her, nails ticking softly on gravel. She paused at the edge of the lamplight, then eased closer, gaze never leaving the road. Only when a distant engine downshifted did she move to the tailgate, leaping up with practiced ease to settle on the quilt and face the approaching sound. As weeks passed, one question grew heavier than the others. She could have chosen any warm shed, any hidden culvert, any dark hollow in the fields. Instead, night after night, she came back to his yard, his truck, the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, always turning her head toward the highway as if waiting for a particular rumble to appear. Hank watched her silhouette against the faint glow of passing rigs and wondered, why here? And what was she hoping would come back? Hank hadn't always lived in the quiet slipstream of a small town. For most of his life, the highway had been home, its mile markers more familiar than street names. Head hauled everything from lumber to oranges, chasing delivery windows across states while coffee cooled in the cup holder. There had been a time when his logbooks were thick and his days were measured in hours behind the wheel, not in trips to the grocery and hardware store. Back then, he hadn't driven alone. His wife, Maggie, rode the early years with him, curling up to nap in the back on long runs. She had stitched the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed from pieces of shirts head worn thin, smiling as she worked in the glow of the dash lights. Something soft in all this metal, Shed joked, tucking it neatly over the makeshift mattress they kept for layovers and roadside breaks. One rainy night decades ago, they'd passed a small, hunched shape at the edge of the shoulder, illuminated for a heartbeat in the headlights. Maggie had lifted her hand toward the window, urging him to slow. Hank, wrestling with slick roads and a tight delivery schedule, had muttered about deadlines and weight limits. By the time his better sense caught up, the shape was a memory in the rearview mirror, swallowed by darkness. The next afternoon, rolling back along that same stretch, they'd seen it. A little wooden cross near the ditch, decorated with a scrap of red ribbon. Hank's throat had closed around the knowledge that someone else had stopped when he had not. For years afterward, whenever Maggie's fingers brushed the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, he felt the sting of that unkept chance hiding in its folds. The regret rode with him longer than any freight. Life had narrowed since Maggie's passing. The big runs disappeared first, then the medium ones, until he kept mostly local routes and finally retired altogether. The truck remained, though parked in the yard like a faithful old friend with nowhere to go. The quilt stayed too, faded by sun and weather, yet still carrying the smell of diesel and the ghost of Maggie's lilting laugh. Hank rarely touched it now, afraid of waking echoes. When the stray visitor began choosing his yard, he tried not to read meaning into it. But on a still morning, he caught her walking along the road's edge, head down, following the white line with the weary precision of someone who had travelled often and far. A faint scar marked where a collar had once rested around her neck. Whoever had ridden with her was gone now, leaving only habits that pulled her back to asphalt and engines. He started moving the bowl closer to the tailgate, then onto it, then finally into the bed itself. Each small shift took days. She would stop, study the new placement, and retreat, only to edge nearer on the next night. Hank sat on the back step, hands wrapped around his mug, pretending patience he didn't fully feel, giving her the space he wished someone long ago had given him. Up close, when she finally allowed it, he saw how thin she was beneath the swelling of her middle. Her pores were roughened, the pads darkened from miles of hot pavement. Yet her eyes were bright, alert, tracking every change in the night. When a rig roared past, she lifted her head, listening not just to the sound but to the rhythm of the engine, as if comparing it against some remembered pattern she still hoped to recognize. Hank recognized something in that watchfulness. He too checked each passing truck, not for company logos or loads, but for the simple fact of movement, the proof that some part of his old world still rolled on. The house felt too still most days, the yard too quiet. The visitor's pacing mirrored the restless loops inside his own chest, a shared unease that neither of them quite knew what to do with. Trust didn't come quickly. Whenever he shifted his weight or let the screen door click too loudly, she flinched and retreated, leaving the quilt empty and the bowl half finished. Hank would stand there afterward, annoyed at himself for moving wrong, for letting his presence feel like another risk to a creature who'd already seen too many roads. It struck him that he wasn't sure which one of them was more afraid of being left again. The turning point slipped in on a morning so grey the sky and ground seemed to trade places. Hank woke to an odd silence, the kind that made the air feel thick. No clink of the bowl, no faint creak from the truck bed. When he stepped outside, the frost had melted into a thin sheen of ice, and the prints that usually crisscrossed the gravel were missing. He told himself it was bound to happen. Travellers moved on. Routes changed. Still, a heaviness settled in his chest as he moved through his coffee, his chores, his half-hearted tidying of the kitchen counter. By afternoon, low clouds pressed closer, promising sleet. He pulled on his jacket to cover the truck, more out of habit than necessity, when a flicker of motion near the ditch caught his eye. She emerged from under the scrub brush, soaked to the skin, her coat clinging in dark lines along her ribs. Mud streaked her legs, and tiny ice crystals clung to her whiskers. She limped slightly, favouring one paw, but her eyes remained fixed on the truck. Hank stood completely still as she made her way up the slight grade, shivering, every breath a visible puff in the cold air. Without thinking, he lowered the tailgate and folded back the edge of the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, creating a hollow of dry cotton. For a long heartbeat they faced each other, the wind tugging at his sleeves, her sides heaving with the effort of standing. Then, with a small, weary jump, she climbed into the bed and curled onto the quilt, tucking her nose under her tail. Hank climbed onto the bumper, careful and slow. He kept his gloved hand low, fingers open, letting the chilly air carry his scent. When he finally laid his hand lightly against her flank, she tensed but did not pull away. Under his palm he felt the firm, rolling nudge of life, a tiny movement that made his throat tighten. Easy there. Girl, he murmured, voice rough, unsure who he was, reassuring. The sky darkened, and the first pellets of sleet began to tap against the metal sides of the truck. He tugged another corner of the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed over her back, creating a small tent of warmth. She sighed, eyes half closing. Yet every time a vehicle approached on the highway, she raised her head, listening intently to the pitch of the engine, the weight of the sound on wet pavement, as the lights of a passing rig swept across the yard. She stared toward the west, toward a green highway sign barely visible beyond the trees. Hank followed her gaze and read the familiar numbers. That exit led to the big truck stop where he and Maggie used to change drivers, the same stretch of road where Head once failed to stop for a creature in need. The recognition slid through him like cold water. In the days that followed, the gap between them narrowed further. She began arriving before dusk, watching from the fence line as he tinkered with the truck or swept the porch. Sometimes she would tap her nose against the dangling keys by the door, then trot to the gate, glancing back as if expecting him to follow. When he finally took her on a short ride down the empty county road, she settled beside him with a familiarity that startled him. Back home, he fixed a pallet for her in the shed, layering old towels and a spare blanket. She sniffed at it politely, then walked past, hopping into the bed and circling twice before settling once more on the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed. No matter how often he tried to coax her inside, she chose that spot, facing the road, as if some part of her believed her journey would be measured from there. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the trees, Hank sat on the tailgate with her head resting near his knee. he found himself speaking aloud about miles head driven, about Maggie and the quilt and the cross on the roadside years ago. The dog, though the words still felt new in his mind, lifted her gaze briefly to his face, then back to the highway. It felt less like confession and more like reporting for duty. Something between them had shifted, but toward what? He couldn't yet say. The storm they'd been teasing on the radio all week finally arrived with a full throat. By dusk, wind shoved at the trees, and rain blurred the line between sky and ground. Hank flipped between stations until he found the local weather, warning about flash floods near low bridges. He pictured the creek a mile down the highway, the one that liked to crawl over the road whenever the clouds got ambitious. A scratch at the back door came earlier than usual. When he opened it, she stood there dripping, eyes wide, sides working rapidly. She paced between the porch and the truck, nails slipping on wet boards. Something urgent in the way she kept glancing back at him. Hank felt a tightness gather behind his ribs. Her belly, once a steady swell, now looked tense and shifting, the muscles along her flanks jumping in uneven waves. He lowered the tailgate and smoothed the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed with both hands, pressing out puddles, creating as much dry space as he could. She leapt up with less grace than usual, circling only once before sinking down, panting. A tremor ran through her body. Hank knelt beside the bed, his hand on the cool metal, and watched as another contraction rippled under her skin, strong enough to make her claws dig into the fabric. Thunder rolled overhead, rattling the loose gutter above the porch. He grabbed his beat-up first aid box from the cab and the camping lantern he kept for breakdowns, setting the lantern near her hip. Warm light pooled over the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, painting her coat in shades of amber and copper. Her eyes met his, wide and trusting in a way that scared him more than the weather. Time slid into a narrow tunnel of counting breaths and watching the clock on the dash. She strained, rested, strained again, but nothing more than a few drops of fluid darkened the quilt. Hank tried to remember scattershot advice he'd heard over years of truck stop conversations and farm deliveries, none of it forming into anything like instruction. The sound of the rain grew heavier, drumming against the metal roof like worried fingers. Finally, he snatched his phone from his pocket and called the small-town vet. The voice on the other end was calm but concerned. Too long between contractions. Maybe a pup stuck. Better bring her in. The vet warned him about the creek near mile marker 12, already close to spilling. Hank looked at the wipers resting idle on the windshield, at the blurry smear of headlights sliding past on the highway, and felt his stomach clench. Driving at night in a storm wasn't new to him, but age and time had dulled the old confidence. His eyes tired faster. His hands stiffened on the wheel. Head promised himself, after Maggie died, that he'd stop chasing trouble and let younger drivers handle the bad weather. Now, though, trouble had come to his yard and curled up on the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, trusting him to decide whether they moved or stayed. She whined softly, pushing her nose into his wrist, then flicking a painful glance toward the highway. The message needed no words. Something had to change. Hank swallowed, heart thudding, and shrugged into his heaviest jacket. He grabbed the orange traffic cone he kept for roadside emergencies, tossing it onto the passenger floor, and climbed into the cab. The engine coughed once, then caught, the rumble familiar and strangely comforting. Backing out onto the road, he felt the tires slosh through, forming puddles. The dog shifted behind him, another contraction twisting her body. He kept talking, nonsense words and gentle assurances, as much to steady his own nerves as hers. When they passed the yard's edge, a gust of wind shoved the truck sideways, and he tightened his grip, jaw clenched. The lane ahead disappeared into sheets of rain. A quarter-mile down, the glow of his headlights caught white water churning angrily in the ditch. He slowed, squinting, and that was when he saw it. A pair of hazard lights blinking weakly farther along the grade, barely visible through the storm's curtain. Something small and dark sat skewed toward the edge of the low bridge, too still to be empty, too crooked to be safe. Hank's stomach dropped. He rolled the truck to a stop on the shoulder just before the water, engine idling. Behind him, the dog let out a deep, shaky breath, bracing herself against another wave of pain. Hank stared at the troubled creek, then at the distant, blinking lights, feeling the past and present crash together like thunder. It wasn't just one life depending on him now. There were at least two, maybe more, and the road ahead left him no room to simply drive on by. Hank flipped on his hazard lights and stepped out into the storm, the wind shoving rain straight into his face. He set the orange traffic cone on the shoulder behind the truck, its bright colour a small protest against the grey blur of sky and water. The road's surface felt slick and uncertain under his boots. Every step a negotiation between balance and urgency. From the bed came a low, determined bark. He turned to see her struggling to her feet on the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, muscles quivering, eyes fixed on the distant hazard lights. Another contraction hit, bowing her spine, yet she stayed upright, panting, watching him as if to make sure he understood they weren't here by accident. The sight set his jaw in a hard, familiar line. He picked his way closer to the bridge, stopping where the pavement dipped toward the swollen creek. Through the rain, he could finally make out the car. a compact sedan nose down near the guardrail, one wheel hanging uselessly over the drop. Water licked at the front bumper, swirling higher with each passing minute. A man clung to the open window frame, shouting words the storm shredded into ragged sound. "Hang on," Hank bellowed back, voice scraping his throat. "Don't try to jump." The man shook his head frantically, gesturing to the back seat, then wrapping one arm around the window as the car shifted slightly. Hank felt his chest tighten. Even if the driver made it, the vehicle might not hold much longer. Memories of that long ago cross by the roadside flickered like lightning behind his eyes. He would not leave another marker behind. He stumbled back to the truck, rummaging through the toolbox until his fingers closed around the heavy tow strap. As he wrestled it free, the dog, still balanced on the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, let out another sharp bark, then another, arranging them between her laboured breaths. The sound sliced through the storm with surprising strength, a steady beacon of noise in the chaos. The man in the car heard her. Hank saw his head turn toward the truck, his grip on the window tightening. He shouted again, clearer this time. Something about not being able to swim and the water already soaking the floorboards. Hank fought the wind and his own protesting knees, edging only as far as the firmest patch of pavement before the dark water hungrily lapped at his boots. He tossed one end of the tow strap toward the car, the first throw falling short. The dog barked again, a fierce, guttural sound that seemed to push the strap farther on the second try. This time it hit the hood and slid down toward the driver's reaching hand. Guided by Hank's shouted instructions and that relentless barking, the man looped the strap around the frame near the wheel, fingers fumbling but determined. Back in the cab, Hank slipped the other end of the strap over the hitch, hands shaking. He spared a glance in the rearview mirror. Between contractions, the dog had sunk onto her side, but her eyes remained open, trained on the car as if counting each second alongside him. He eased the truck into gear, gently pressing the accelerator, feeling the tow line tighten like a held breath. The tires spun once, then bit down, inch by inch. The truck dragged the sedan up the slick slope, water slapping at the rear bumper before reluctantly letting go. When the car finally reached the safer stretch near the orange traffic cone, Hank exhaled so hard his ribs ached. The driver scrambled out, soaked and trembling, clutching a duffel bag decorated with tiny pastel moons and clouds. "My wife's at the hospital," the man gasped, voice breaking with shock and relief. "Baby's coming early. I thought I was done." Hank nodded, ushering him toward the cab, mind already jumping back to the bed. The man paused when he heard a low whimper from behind the truck, eyes widening as he spotted the lantern-lit shape inside. Hank climbed onto the tailgate, heart pounding. There, nestled against the dog's belly on the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, lay a tiny, wet, trembling shape, its sides fluttering with quick, uncertain breaths. The mother nudged it gently with her nose, then turned exhausted eyes toward Hank. In that quiet bubble between thunderclaps, past and present wove together. And he understood. She hadn't only brought her labour to his yard. She had steered him to this mile, on this night, to make sure none of them were left alone in their need. By the time spring settled in for good, the creek had shrunk back to its tame, meandering self, as if it had never threatened anything more than a pair of rubber boots. Grass pushed through the gravel near the bridge, and someone Hank never knew who had placed a small bouquet of plastic flowers by the guardrail. A quiet thank you to the unknown helper. He drove past it often, windows cracked to let in the mild air. In the mornings now, Quilt rode up front, curled in the passenger seat with her head near the open vent, while the single pup Hank had kept explored the back. He named the youngster Miles, a nod to the distance between where they'd all started and where they'd landed. Miles treated the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed like a kingdom, pouncing on its faded squares before collapsing in a satisfied heap. Hank no longer chased cross-country contracts. Instead, he took shorter hauls for neighbours and nearby farms, feed sacks, lumber, crates of parts that could wait an extra hour if the weather turned. His routes looped through familiar small towns where folks waved as he passed, recognizing both him and the two sets of ears that often appeared in the window. The highway still called, but now it sounded more like a friendly greeting than a summons. Whenever he crossed the low bridge, he slowed and glanced at the orange traffic cone strapped behind the cab, a reminder of the nighthead finally stopped. Sometimes he caught sight of the man head pulled from the flood, standing on the hospital lawn with a stroller, lifting a hand in a shy salute as Hank rolled by. The world felt stitched together in new patterns, like Maggie's quilt, mismatched pieces forming something unexpectedly whole. On certain days, they swung by the vet's office just to say hello. Staff stepped outside to stroke Quilt's now greying muzzle and marvel at Miles' growing paws. There were jokes about how he'd need a bigger truck bed soon, but the dog simply thumped his tail against the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, content. Hank listened to their laughter and felt his own shoulders loosen in ways they hadn't in years. Evenings often found them parked behind the diner, where the cook sent out a plate of scraps and an extra piece of pie. Hank sat on the tailgate, coffee in hand, while Quilt rested her chin on his knee and Miles curled close by. Locals drifted over to share stories about near misses on dark roads. Bad winters survived, and the strange comfort of knowing someone out there would stop when trouble came calling. The restless feeling that had once roamed his yard like a ghost eased into something steadier. Hank still listened for unusual sounds at night, but now they were usually just the familiar click of toenails on the porch or the gentle creak of the truck's springs as Quilt settled in. Rather than a nagging sense of unfinished business, he felt a quiet readiness, a shared understanding that if the road ever asked again, they would answer it together. Years folded over one another until Hank began marking time less by calendar pages and more by the changing weight of the air. Springs grew softer, summers slower. The highway remained, a steady hum beyond the trees. But he rarely ventured far from the stretch that felt like home. Every so often he'd still wake at odd hours, listening, only to smile when he heard gentle breathing from the foot of his bed. Quilt moved carefully now, easing her stiff joints one at a time as she climbed into the truck. She no longer leapt, but she still insisted on settling onto the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, as if the stitched fabric were the only place her bones truly understood. Miles, fully grown and thick-chested, stood guard at the tailgate, watching her arrange herself before curling nearby. His presence, a warm, solid barrier against the world. Hank kept the toe strap neatly coiled behind the seat and the orange traffic cone tucked where he could reach it, though most nights it stayed put. The emergencies grew smaller with time, a neighbour's stalled engine, a flat tyre outside the diner, an elderly farmer needing a ride when his truck wouldn't start. Each favour felt like a quiet chapter in the same long story, one that no longer required thunder to make its point. Sometimes at the diner, younger drivers would ask about the pair of dogs always seen in his truck. Hank would tell them about the night the creek rose and how a mother laboured on the quilt while another family waited in a distant hospital. He didn't dramatise it. He simply described the choices. The strap, the cone, the fragile breaths of a brand new life on the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed. Miles would press close during those stories, as if remembering too. On clear evenings, when the sky stretched wide and full of quiet stars, Hank parked the truck at the edge of his yard and left the tailgate down. Quilt and Miles settled together on the old patchwork quilt in the truck bed, bodies touching from shoulder to paw. Hank pulled a lawn chair close, listening to their contented sighs and the distant whisper of tyres on the highway. He no longer felt the tug to chase those sounds. Instead, he felt something gentler, the sure knowledge that, when it had truly counted, he had stopped. He had stayed. And because of that, none of them were facing their roads alone. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.